In the dimly lit chambers of his Florence home, Niccolò Machiavelli penned words that would echo through centuries, warning those who would listen about the destructive nature of misplaced loyalty. His observations, drawn from years of political intrigue and human nature study, revealed a fundamental truth: there are certain types of individuals whose support will inevitably lead to your downfall, no matter how noble your intentions or how strong your character. The year was 1513, and Machiavelli had witnessed the rise and fall of princes, the betrayal of allies, and the destruction of well-meaning souls who failed to recognize the warning signs of toxic allegiances. As he reflected on his experiences in the Florentine Republic and his observations of Cesare Borgia's court, he began to identify patterns, recurring character types that consistently drained the life force from those who supported them. "It is better to be feared than loved," Machiavelli had famously written, but, perhaps more importantly, he understood that it was better to be alone than to be surrounded by those who would consume your very essence. His writings revealed not just political strategy, but a deeper understanding of human psychology and the dynamics of power that transcend time and circumstance. The eternal victim, the first destroyer of ambition. The first type that Machiavelli identified was what he called the eternal victim, those individuals who wear their suffering like a crown and demand constant validation for their perpetual state of misfortune. These are the people who transform every conversation into a recounting of their woes, who see themselves as the protagonist in an endless tragedy, and who expect others to serve as their supporting cast in this drama of despair. Machiavelli observed this type frequently in the courts he frequented. Lady Caterina, a minor noble, had perfected the art of victimhood to such a degree that she could turn any gathering into a funeral for her imagined slights. She spoke constantly of how others had wronged her, how fortune had been unkind, how she deserved better treatment from the world. Those who showed her sympathy found themselves trapped in an endless cycle of emotional labor, providing comfort for wounds that never healed because they were constantly being reopened by her own hand. The danger of supporting the eternal victim lies not in their initial misfortune, for genuine suffering deserves genuine compassion, but in their refusal to move beyond their pain. They become addicted to sympathy, creating elaborate narratives of persecution that cast everyone around them as either oppressor or savior. There is no middle ground, no space for mutual respect or equal partnership. When you support an eternal victim, you become complicit in their self-destruction and, more importantly, in your own. They will drain your emotional resources, monopolize your time with their crises, and resent any success or happiness you experience because it threatens their identity as the most suffering person in the room. Your achievements become evidence of your insensitivity to their pain, your joy becomes a betrayal of your loyalty to their sorrow. Machiavelli witnessed a promising young merchant named Alessandro who fell into the orbit of such a person. Alessandro's sister-in-law had perfected the art of crisis, always in need of rescue, always on the brink of disaster, always requiring Alessandro's time, money, and emotional energy. At first, Alessandro felt noble in his support, believing he was demonstrating familial loyalty and Christian compassion. But, over months, then years, he found his own business ventures suffering as he constantly diverted resources to her latest emergency. More insidiously, Alessandro began to absorb her worldview. Her constant complaints about the unfairness of life, the cruelty of others, and the impossibility of true success began to poison his own optimism and ambition. He started to see obstacles as insurmountable rather than challenges to overcome. Her learned helplessness became his learned helplessness, and, eventually, he too became trapped in a cycle of complaint and inaction. The eternal victim operates through emotional manipulation, though they themselves may not consciously recognize it as such. They have learned that suffering grants them power, the power to command attention, to make demands, to extract resources from others without reciprocity. They become skilled at finding the exact pressure points that will motivate others to rescue them, and they instinctively know how to escalate their distress when their support system shows signs of fatigue. Breaking free from the eternal victim requires recognizing that your compassion is being weaponized against you. True suffering calls for genuine help and, then, moves toward healing. False suffering calls for endless attention and moves toward greater dependency. The eternal victim will never thank you for your help because acknowledging your assistance would diminish their narrative of abandonment and persecution. The envious saboteur, the second path to ruin. The second destructive type that Machiavelli identified was the envious saboteur, individuals whose primary motivation is not their own success but the prevention of yours. These are the people who smile to your face while working tirelessly behind the scenes to undermine your efforts, who celebrate your failures with barely concealed glee, and who cannot tolerate the success of others because it illuminates their own inadequacies. Machiavelli encountered this type frequently in political circles, where ambition and opportunity created fertile ground for envy to flourish. Francesco, a fellow diplomat, exemplified this destructive character. Rather than focusing his considerable talents on advancing his own career, Francesco dedicated his energy to sabotaging the efforts of his colleagues. He would spread subtle rumors, withhold crucial information, arrive late to important meetings, and consistently find ways to make others appear incompetent or unreliable. The envious saboteur operates from a scarcity mindset, believing that there is only so much success, happiness, or recognition available in the world, and that another person's gain necessarily represents their loss. This zero-sum thinking transforms them into active enemies of progress, not just for themselves but for anyone in their orbit. What makes the envious saboteur particularly dangerous is their ability to disguise their destructive behavior as concern or friendship. They offer advice designed to misdirect you, suggest opportunities that will waste your time, and provide support that actually undermines your efforts. Francesco would often volunteer to help with important projects, then introduce subtle errors or delays that would compromise the final result while maintaining plausible deniability. The psychological profile of the envious saboteur reveals someone who has given up on their own potential for success and chosen instead to derive satisfaction from limiting others. They have made peace with their own mediocrity by ensuring that excellence remains rare in their environment. This makes them fundamentally incompatible with anyone seeking to improve their circumstances or achieve their goals. Supporting an envious saboteur means providing them with intimate access to your plans, resources, and vulnerabilities, which they will inevitably use against you. They study your weaknesses not to help you overcome them but to exploit them at crucial moments. They learn your dreams not to support them but to find ways to make them seem impossible or foolish. Machiavelli observed that the envious saboteur often targets those who remind them of their own unfulfilled potential. A failed artist will sabotage emerging artists, a stalled entrepreneur will undermine new business ventures, and a bitter academic will work to destroy promising scholars. The saboteur sees in others' ambition a painful reminder of what they themselves could have achieved if they had chosen courage over cowardice, action over envy. The relationship dynamic with an envious saboteur follows a predictable pattern. Initially, they may seem supportive or even encouraging, drawing you into their confidence and learning about your goals and methods. As you begin to make progress, their true nature emerges through increasingly subtle forms of interference. By the time you recognize the pattern, they have often already done significant damage to your relationships, reputation, or resources. Breaking away from envious saboteurs requires developing the wisdom to distinguish between genuine support and disguised opposition. True supporters celebrate your victories and offer constructive help during challenges. Envious saboteurs minimize your victories and offer destructive help that creates new challenges. They reveal themselves through their inability to maintain enthusiasm for your success and their tendency to find problems with every solution you propose. Part 2, The Parasites of Progress. The entitled dependent, the third destroyer of self-worth. The third type in Machiavelli's catalog of destructive relationships was the entitled dependent, individuals who have learned to extract value from others without reciprocating, who demand support as a right rather than appreciating it as a gift, and who gradually expand their expectations until their supporters are left depleted and resentful. During his time observing the Medici court, Machiavelli became fascinated by the dynamics between patrons and their dependents. He noticed that while some protégés used support as a foundation for building their own capabilities, others became increasingly parasitic, developing an ever-expanding sense of entitlement that eventually destroyed the very relationships that sustained them. Lorenzo, a distant relative of a wealthy merchant family, exemplified this destructive pattern. Initially presenting himself as temporarily down on his luck and needing only brief assistance to regain his footing, Lorenzo gradually revealed his true nature as someone who believed the world owed him sustenance simply for existing. What began as small loans became regular financial support. Temporary housing became permanent residence. Occasional favors became constant demands. The entitled dependent operates from a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of relationships and reciprocity. They believe that their needs create obligations in others, that their circumstances grant them special rights to demand support, and that their dependency somehow elevates them above the normal expectations of mutual respect and contribution. What makes the entitled dependent particularly destructive is their ability to make their supporters feel guilty for having boundaries or expectations. They master the art of emotional manipulation, making any attempt to limit support seem cruel or selfish. Lorenzo would respond to requests for reciprocity with wounded expressions and speeches about how his cousin's success had created an obligation to share with less fortunate family members. The psychology behind entitled dependency often stems from early experiences where the individual learned that helplessness and need were more effective than competence and contribution in securing resources and attention. They discovered that being incapable could be more profitable than being capable, that dependency could provide security that independence could not guarantee. Supporting an entitled dependent means entering into a relationship where the terms of exchange become increasingly one-sided. Initially, the imbalance may seem temporary and justifiable, but the dependent person's comfort with taking without giving grows over time. They begin to see your resources as partially their own, your success as something they deserve to benefit from, and your prosperity as evidence that you should be doing more to support them. Machiavelli observed that entitled dependents often develop sophisticated justification systems for their behavior. They create elaborate explanations for why their circumstances excuse them from normal reciprocity, why their needs should take priority over their supporters' needs, and why any attempt to change the dynamic represents a betrayal of loyalty or compassion. The merchant who supported Lorenzo found himself gradually impoverished, not just financially but emotionally and socially. Lorenzo's constant presence and demands isolated him from other relationships, as friends grew tired of gatherings dominated by Lorenzo's needs and complaints. Business opportunities were missed because resources were constantly diverted to Lorenzo's latest crisis. Most devastatingly, the merchant's own children began to resent their father's generosity, seeing family resources flowing to someone who contributed nothing while they were expected to work and earn their place in the household. The entitled dependent also actively resists any attempt to become more self-sufficient, because independence would threaten their access to unearned resources. They sabotage job opportunities, resist skill development, and find excuses to avoid taking responsibility for their own welfare. Their dependency is not a temporary state to be overcome but a permanent lifestyle to be maintained. Breaking free from entitled dependence requires recognizing that true compassion sometimes means refusing to enable destructive behavior. Healthy relationships involve mutual benefit and shared responsibility. When one person consistently takes without giving, both parties are ultimately harmed, the giver through depletion and the taker through atrophy of their own capabilities. The narcissistic controller, the fourth agent of destruction. The fourth destructive type that Machiavelli identified was the narcissistic controller, individuals who demand to be the center of attention in every situation, who manipulate others to serve their ego needs, and who cannot tolerate any relationship dynamic that doesn't position them as superior and dominant. In the competitive environment of Renaissance politics, Machiavelli encountered numerous individuals who displayed these characteristics. Cardinal Bernardino embodied this type perfectly, surrounding himself with sycophants and demanding constant praise and deference from anyone seeking his favor or support. He had developed an elaborate system for ensuring that every interaction reinforced his sense of superiority and control. The narcissistic controller operates from an insatiable need for admiration and validation, but, unlike healthy individuals who seek recognition for genuine achievements, they demand worship simply for existing. They create elaborate performances of their own importance, tell stories that cast them as the hero in every situation, and expect others to serve as their audience and supporting cast. What makes the narcissistic controller particularly dangerous is their ability to initially appear charming and impressive. They often possess genuine talents and accomplishments, which they use to attract supporters and build their personal empire. Cardinal Bernardino was indeed intelligent and well-connected, making his patronage initially seem valuable to ambitious young men seeking advancement in the church hierarchy. However, the true cost of supporting a narcissistic controller becomes apparent over time. They demand not just respect but worship, not just cooperation but subservience. They cannot tolerate any challenge to their authority or any suggestion that others might possess equal or superior capabilities. Any supporter who begins to develop independent success or recognition becomes a threat to be eliminated or diminished. The psychological profile of the narcissistic controller reveals someone whose self-image is fundamentally unstable and requires constant external reinforcement. They have never developed the internal foundation of self-worth that allows for healthy relationships with equals. Instead, they can only feel secure when others are positioned beneath them, providing the contrast that makes them feel superior. Supporting a narcissistic controller means accepting a subordinate position in all interactions. Your ideas become their ideas, your achievements become evidence of their excellent judgment in supporting you, and your independence becomes disloyalty that must be punished. The relationship becomes entirely transactional, with you providing ego gratification in exchange for whatever benefits they choose to dispense. Machiavelli observed that narcissistic controllers often create elaborate hierarchies around themselves, with inner circles of favored supporters who compete for attention and outer circles of those who have fallen from grace. This creates a toxic dynamic where supporters focus more on managing the controller's moods and maintaining their position than on pursuing their own legitimate goals. Young priests who sought Cardinal Bernardino's advancement found themselves trapped in exhausting performances of admiration and submission. They learned to anticipate his need for flattery, to suppress their own opinions when they differed from his, and to accept blame for any failures while giving him credit for any successes. Those who excelled at this performance advanced in the church hierarchy, but at the cost of their own integrity and independent judgment. The narcissistic controller also employs sophisticated punishment and reward systems to maintain control. They provide intermittent reinforcement, occasional displays of favor and generosity that keep supporters hoping for more while accepting long periods of neglect or criticism. This creates an addictive dynamic where supporters become increasingly desperate to regain the controller's approval. Most destructively, the narcissistic controller systematically undermines their supporters' confidence and independence. They criticize initiative, dismiss achievements, and create dependency by making their approval essential for their supporters' sense of self-worth. Over time, supporters lose the ability to make independent decisions or trust their own judgment, becoming increasingly reliant on the controller's guidance and validation. Breaking free from a narcissistic controller requires rebuilding your own sense of self-worth and independent judgment. This often means accepting that the relationship was never based on genuine respect or mutual benefit, but rather on the controller's need for superiority and your willingness to provide it. True leaders elevate those around them, narcissistic controllers diminish everyone else to elevate themselves. The chronic pessimist, the fifth destroyer of hope. The fifth destructive type in Machiavelli's analysis was the chronic pessimist, individuals who have made negativity their default worldview and who systematically drain optimism and hope from anyone who spends significant time in their presence. These are people who find the dark side in every situation, who respond to opportunities with warnings about failure, and who have convinced themselves that expecting the worst is a form of wisdom. During his observations of Florentine society, Machiavelli became acquainted with Benedetto, a learned man who had once shown promise as a philosopher but who had gradually become consumed by a bitter cynicism that poisoned every interaction. Benedetto had developed the ability to find potential disaster in any plan, danger in any opportunity, and futility in any effort at improvement or progress. The chronic pessimist operates from a worldview that sees suffering and failure as inevitable, success as temporary and meaningless, and hope as a dangerous delusion that leads only to greater disappointment. They have often experienced genuine setbacks or traumas that initially justified their caution, but they have allowed these experiences to metastasize into a comprehensive philosophy of despair. What makes the chronic pessimist particularly destructive is their ability to present their negativity as superior insight and their pessimism as protective wisdom. They claim to be helping others by tempering their expectations and preparing them for inevitable disappointment. Benedetto would respond to any ambitious plan by listing all the ways it could fail, any expression of hope by recounting historical examples of similar hopes being crushed, and any moment of joy by pointing out its temporary nature. The psychological mechanism behind chronic pessimism often involves a defensive strategy for avoiding disappointment. By expecting the worst, the pessimist believes they can protect themselves from the pain of unmet expectations. However, this strategy ultimately becomes self-fulfilling, as their negative expectations influence their behavior in ways that make positive outcomes less likely. Supporting a chronic pessimist means having your own optimism and ambition constantly under attack. Every plan you share becomes an opportunity for them to explain why it won't work. Every success you achieve becomes evidence that you're setting yourself up for a greater fall. Every moment of happiness becomes a reminder that sadness is waiting around the corner. Machiavelli observed that chronic pessimists often surround themselves with others who validate their negative worldview, creating echo chambers of despair where hope and ambition are seen as naive and unrealistic. They develop sophisticated philosophical justifications for their pessimism, citing ancient wisdom, statistical probabilities, and historical patterns to support their conviction that positive outcomes are rare and temporary. The merchant who became close friends with Benedetto found his own entrepreneurial spirit gradually withering under the constant barrage of warnings and predictions of failure. Business opportunities that once excited him began to seem fraught with danger. Plans that once energized him began to feel foolish and unrealistic. The optimism that had driven his earlier success transformed into a paralyzing awareness of all the things that could go wrong. The chronic pessimist also actively discourages others from taking risks or pursuing opportunities, often in the name of protecting them from disappointment. They become invested in proving their negative predictions correct, because vindication of their pessimism validates their entire worldview and approach to life. More insidiously, chronic pessimists often present themselves as more intelligent and realistic than optimistic people, creating a false dichotomy between naive hopefulness and sophisticated awareness of life's difficulties. This allows them to feel superior while remaining passive, claiming wisdom while avoiding the risks that accompany action and growth. The relationship dynamic with a chronic pessimist becomes increasingly draining as they require constant validation of their negative worldview. They seek out bad news to share, focus on problems rather than solutions, and interpret neutral or positive events through the lens of impending doom. Their presence transforms celebrations into wakes and planning sessions into litanies of potential disasters. Breaking free from chronic pessimists requires recognizing that their negativity is not superior wisdom but a defensive mechanism that has become a prison. Realistic assessment of challenges is valuable, systematic discouragement of hope and action is destructive. Healthy relationships include both support during difficulties and encouragement toward growth and opportunity. Part 3, The Final Liberation. The Fair-weather opportunist, the sixth and final destroyer. The sixth and most insidious type that Machiavelli identified was the fair-weather opportunist, individuals who attach themselves to others during times of success and abundance, only to disappear or even turn hostile when circumstances become challenging. These are people who mistake opportunity for friendship, who confuse mutual benefit with loyalty, and who reveal their true nature only when their support is most needed. In his extensive experience with political alliances and courtly relationships, Machiavelli witnessed countless examples of this behavior. Duke Alessandro's rise to power had attracted numerous supporters who proclaimed their loyalty and friendship, but when his position became precarious due to political upheaval, these same individuals not only abandoned him but actively supported his enemies to curry favor with the new power structure. The fair-weather opportunist operates from a purely transactional view of relationships, though they are skilled at disguising this approach as genuine affection and loyalty. They understand instinctively that appearing supportive during good times requires minimal investment while potentially yielding significant returns, so they master the art of enthusiastic partnership when the costs are low and the benefits are high. What makes the fair-weather opportunist particularly dangerous is their ability to seem like ideal supporters during periods of success. They celebrate your victories, amplify your achievements, and appear genuinely invested in your continued prosperity. Their enthusiasm can feel validating and energizing, making their eventual betrayal all the more devastating when circumstances change. Marco, a young merchant who had built a successful trading business, attracted numerous fair-weather opportunists during his period of rapid growth. These individuals praised his business acumen, sought his advice on their own ventures, and positioned themselves as loyal friends and supporters. They attended his celebrations, recommended him to potential clients, and seemed genuinely committed to his success. The psychological profile of the fair-weather opportunist reveals someone who has learned to extract maximum value from relationships while investing minimum emotional or practical commitment. They have developed sophisticated skills in reading social and professional currents, positioning themselves advantageously when times are good, and protecting themselves when times turn difficult. The true test of any relationship comes during periods of challenge, uncertainty, or failure. It is during these times that authentic supporters demonstrate their genuine commitment, while fair-weather opportunists reveal their true nature. When Marco's business faced difficulties due to political instability affecting trade routes, his supposed friends and supporters quickly disappeared. Supporting fair-weather opportunists means investing emotional and practical resources and relationships that will provide no return when you most need support. Worse, these individuals often become active obstacles during difficult periods, as they seek to distance themselves from your problems or even exploit your weaknesses for their own advantage. The opportunist's abandonment follows a predictable pattern. Initially, they may simply become less available, claiming other commitments or expressing concern about the challenges you're facing. As your situation becomes more difficult, they begin to distance themselves more actively, avoiding social situations where they might be associated with your problems. Finally, they may openly criticize decisions they previously supported or even provide assistance to competitors or enemies. Machiavelli observed that fair-weather opportunists often rationalize their abandonment by reframing the relationship history. They begin to remember your successes as lucky breaks rather than earned achievements, your generous support of them as attempts to buy their loyalty, and your current difficulties as evidence of character flaws they claim to have noticed all along. The merchant Marco discovered that several of his supposed supporters not only abandoned him during his business crisis but actively worked to accelerate his downfall. They spread rumors about his financial stability, encouraged suppliers to demand immediate payment, and even provided confidential information about his business practices to competitors. Their intimate knowledge of his operations, gained during years of apparent friendship, became weapons used against him. The fair-weather opportunist represents perhaps the most psychologically damaging type of destructive relationship because their betrayal comes precisely when support is most needed and their abandonment carries the additional wound of revealed deception. The relationship you believed was based on mutual respect and affection is revealed to have been purely transactional from their perspective. Recovery from fair-weather opportunist relationships requires developing better criteria for distinguishing between genuine supporters and skilled performers. True friends and allies demonstrate consistency across varying circumstances, offer support during challenges as well as celebrations, and maintain loyalty even when association becomes costly rather than profitable. The path to freedom, recognizing and escaping destructive patterns. Understanding these 6 destructive types is only the beginning of protecting yourself from their influence. Machiavelli's true wisdom lay not just in identifying these patterns but in developing strategies for recognition, extraction, and prevention that would allow principled individuals to build genuinely supportive relationships while avoiding the snares of toxic alliance. The process of liberation begins with honest self-assessment. Many people who find themselves repeatedly supporting destructive individuals do so because of their own psychological vulnerabilities or misguided beliefs about loyalty, compassion, and social obligation. Recognizing your own patterns of attraction to these types is essential for breaking free from their influence. Common vulnerabilities that attract destructive supporters include excessive empathy that blinds you to manipulation, need for approval that makes you tolerant of poor treatment, fear of conflict that prevents necessary confrontations, and misunderstanding of loyalty that makes abandoning destructive relationships seem like moral failure. The eternal victim targets individuals who feel responsible for others' emotional well-being and who mistake enabling for compassion. The envious saboteur attracts those who are naive about human nature and who assume others share their good intentions. The entitled dependent seeks out generous individuals who struggle with boundaries and who confuse kindness with unlimited giving. The narcissistic controller gravitates toward people who undervalue themselves and who seek external validation for their worth. The chronic pessimist appeals to those who mistake cynicism for wisdom and who fear being seen as unrealistic or naive. The fair-weather opportunist targets successful individuals who enjoy having their achievements celebrated and who mistake enthusiasm for loyalty. Breaking free from any of these destructive relationship patterns requires developing new skills and perspectives. You must learn to distinguish between genuine need and manipulative demand, between constructive criticism and systematic discouragement, between temporary support and permanent dependence, between healthy mutual benefit and exploitative extraction. Setting and maintaining boundaries becomes crucial for protecting yourself from these destructive influences. This means learning to say no to unreasonable demands, to limit your investment in one-sided relationships, to refuse to accept abuse disguised as friendship, and to prioritize your own well-being over others' comfort with their dysfunction. The process of extracting yourself from established destructive relationships often involves accepting that these individuals will not change through your support or influence. The eternal victim has no interest in healing because their identity depends on suffering. The envious saboteur cannot celebrate others' success because it threatens their excuse for their own failures. The entitled dependent will not develop independence because dependency is more profitable. Recognizing these truths can be painful, especially when you have invested significant time, energy, or resources in these relationships. However, continuing to support destructive individuals ultimately serves no one's interests, including their own. Your enablement prevents them from experiencing the natural consequences of their behavior that might motivate genuine change. Building healthy relationships requires developing new criteria for selecting companions, colleagues, and confidants. Look for individuals who demonstrate consistency between their words and actions, who take responsibility for their own circumstances and emotions, who celebrate others' successes without diminishing their own value, and who offer support during challenges as well as benefits during prosperous times. Healthy relationships involve mutual benefit, shared responsibility, reciprocal support, and respect for each other's autonomy and growth. In these relationships, both parties contribute to each other's well-being and success. Challenges are addressed constructively rather than used as opportunities for manipulation, and individual achievements enhance rather than threaten the partnership. The wisdom of Machiavelli's observations lies not in promoting coldness or selfishness, but in recognizing that genuine compassion sometimes requires difficult choices. True kindness may mean refusing to enable destructive behavior. Real loyalty may mean abandoning relationships that prevent growth and flourishing. Authentic generosity may mean conserving your resources for those who will use them constructively rather than squandering them on those who will abuse them. The renaissance of self-preservation. As Machiavelli completed his observations on these destructive relationship patterns, he reflected on the broader implications for anyone seeking to build a meaningful and successful life. The 6 types he had identified, the eternal victim, the envious saboteur, the entitled dependent, the narcissistic controller, the chronic pessimist, and the fair-weather opportunist, represented not just individual character flaws but systematic approaches to extracting value from others while contributing nothing positive in return. The cumulative effect of supporting these destructive individuals extends far beyond the immediate drain on resources, time, and emotional energy. These relationships fundamentally alter your perspective on human nature, your expectations for partnership and friendship, and your willingness to trust and invest in others. They can transform generous, optimistic, ambitious individuals into cautious, bitter, isolated people who have learned to expect the worst from human relationships. Perhaps most tragically, supporting destructive individuals often prevents you from recognizing and cultivating healthy relationships. The time and energy devoted to managing toxic personalities is time and energy unavailable for building genuine partnerships. The emotional exhaustion that comes from constant manipulation and disappointment reduces your capacity to appreciate and reciprocate authentic care and support. The merchant who finally extracted himself from Lorenzo's entitled dependency discovered that his isolation from other relationships had been largely self-imposed, driven by embarrassment about his situation and inability to engage fully with others while managing Lorenzo's constant demands. Once freed from this burden, he was amazed to discover how many genuine friends had been waiting for an opportunity to connect with him. Similarly, the young diplomat who recognized and escaped from Francesco's envious sabotage found that his career prospects improved dramatically once he was no longer being systematically undermined. Opportunities that had seemed impossible suddenly became available, and colleagues who had seemed hostile revealed themselves to have been responding to Francesco's manipulation rather than their own judgment. The liberation from destructive relationships often reveals how much energy and potential had been suppressed by these toxic dynamics. Like a garden that flourishes once weeds are removed, your own capabilities and opportunities expand when they are no longer being choked by parasitic relationships. However, the process of building healthy relationships after experiencing destructive ones requires patience and wisdom. The natural tendency after recognizing manipulation is to become overly suspicious and defensive, to interpret every request for support as potential exploitation, and to withdraw from all vulnerable interactions to avoid future harm. True wisdom lies in learning to distinguish between healthy vulnerability and dangerous exposure, between genuine requests for support and manipulative demands, between temporary challenges that call for assistance and permanent dependency that calls for boundaries. This discernment develops over time as you gain experience with healthier relationship dynamics and learn to trust your instincts about others' motivations and character. The ultimate goal is not to become immune to others' needs or to approach relationships with calculated selfishness, but rather to develop the wisdom to invest your limited resources, time, energy, attention, and material goods in ways that promote mutual flourishing rather than one-sided extraction. This means supporting those who use assistance to build greater capacity for independence and contribution, while refusing to enable those who use support to avoid responsibility and growth. Machiavelli's insights about destructive relationships ultimately serve a constructive purpose. By learning to recognize and avoid these patterns, you create space in your life for relationships that genuinely enhance your well-being and contribute to your growth. The energy not wasted on eternal victims can be invested in mentoring those who genuinely want to overcome their challenges. The resources not squandered on entitled dependents can be used to support worthy causes and promising individuals who will multiply rather than merely consume your investment. The time not spent managing narcissistic controllers can be devoted to building partnerships with secure individuals who value your contributions and support your autonomous development. The emotional capacity not drained by chronic pessimists can be directed toward relationships that include both realistic assessment of challenges and enthusiastic support for opportunities and growth. Most importantly, by refusing to support destructive individuals, you model healthy relationship dynamics and demonstrate that manipulation, exploitation, and toxic behavior will not be rewarded with continued access to your resources and attention. This not only protects you but potentially motivates positive change in others who recognize that their destructive patterns must change if they want to maintain valuable relationships. The legacy of Machiavelli's observations extends beyond individual self-protection to social transformation. When enough people learn to recognize and refuse destructive relationship patterns, these behaviors become less profitable and, therefore, less common. Eternal victims are motivated to seek genuine healing when their suffering no longer commands automatic sympathy and support. Envious saboteurs are forced to develop their own capabilities when undermining others no longer provides secondary benefits. Entitled dependents must learn independence when dependency no longer guarantees ongoing support. Narcissistic controllers must develop genuine leadership skills when manipulation no longer attracts followers. Chronic pessimists must find more balanced perspectives when their negativity no longer provides social connection. Fair-weather opportunists must learn authentic loyalty when their abandonment patterns become recognized and rejected. The transformation that comes from implementing Machiavelli's insights is ultimately about reclaiming your agency and directing your life force toward relationships and activities that align with your values and support your flourishing. It is about refusing to allow your compassion to be weaponized against you, your generosity to be exploited for others' benefit, and your loyalty to be taken for granted by those who offer nothing in return. This is not about becoming cold or calculating in your relationships, but about becoming wise and discerning. It is about learning to love effectively rather than destructively, to give strategically rather than compulsively, and to support others in ways that genuinely help them rather than enabling their dysfunction. The 6 destructive types that Machiavelli identified represent warnings about human nature's potential for exploitation and manipulation, but they also represent opportunities for growth in wisdom, discernment, and authentic compassion. By learning to recognize these patterns and developing the courage to extract yourself from destructive relationships, you not only protect your own well-being but also contribute to a social environment where healthy relationship dynamics are rewarded and toxic behaviors are discouraged. In the end, Machiavelli's greatest insight was not that human nature is inherently selfish or that relationships are inevitably exploitative, but that wisdom lies in learning to distinguish between those who will enhance your life and those who will diminish it. The choice of whom to support is perhaps one of the most important decisions you will make, for these relationships will ultimately determine not only your material success but your emotional well-being, your personal growth, and your ability to contribute positively to the world around you. The path forward is clear. Learn to recognize the 6 destructive types, develop the courage to extract yourself from their influence, and commit your limited resources to relationships that truly deserve your investment. In doing so, you honor not only your own potential for flourishing but also the genuine needs of those who would use your support to become more capable, generous, and positive forces in the world. This is the true wisdom of Machiavelli's observations, that self-preservation and genuine compassion ultimately serve the same goal: the creation of a world where human relationships enhance rather than diminish our individual and collective potential for growth, contribution, and authentic happiness. The liberation from destructive relationships is not an end in itself but the beginning of possibilities that can only emerge when your energy is no longer being systematically drained by those who take without giving, manipulate without reciprocating, and demand without contributing. The choice, as always, remains yours. Will you continue supporting those who diminish your life, or will you find the courage to redirect your precious resources toward relationships that truly deserve them? The answer to this question will determine not only your own fate but your contribution to the kind of world you want to live in and leave behind.